Welcome back to Simplifying the State, the podcast where we break down politics so you don't have to try to figure out why student journalists have more freedom in Arkansas than they do in Missouri. As always, I'm Adam Watson.
And I'm Drew Garfinkel.
All right, before we start, please rate the podcast and follow it wherever you're listening and share it with anyone you think would enjoy it, like the Missouri House Education Committee. Okay, so today's subject is going to be one that really closely relates to Missouri. That is basically the rights of student journalists. And that's important because as we speak in the Missouri House Education Committee, there is a bill being debated called the Cronkite New Voices Act, HB 2918. And that would basically provide student journalists with independence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that bill later. But Drew, what are your thoughts? Do you think that student journalists, should have more freedom than they do now?
Well, as student journalist, yeah. It's kind of like, we're obviously a bit biased here, but
right.
Yeah, I think it's American, being able to speak your mind.
Do you think that, student journalists are, well, what do you think the role of student journalists is compared to that of, adult, like professional journalists?
I guess to talk more like pertaining to high schoolers or like college students, because like adult journalists, they're like talking about anything, but what we're looking at is kind of through the lens of students. That's for me the biggest difference. There's probably other stuff. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think 100% I agree with your point. I mean, so often people our age do not see themselves represented in news stories or do not see stories they care about being talked about outside of a school newspaper. And I think it's very important that, student journalists have the freedom to write and publish stories that matter to the student body and to the community they report on in an angle that they are interested in and that matters to them. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's our job. Like, that's what I try to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what we do here. We try to talk about politics in a way that matters to high schoolers, Yeah. So basically, the reason we might need a bill is because of a case that actually originated here in Missouri, Hazelwood School District v. Kumar, I think is how you pronounce that last name. Basically, these student journalists at Hazelwood East High School, they wrote a story within it, and then the principal received the school newspaper through a policy of prior review. Basically, the school was allowed to look at the stories that were being published, and they had the right to veto or change them or anything like that. And they deemed that a story within the paper was inappropriate, and so they stopped that issue from being published. The students sued the school district, made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-3 decision, they determined that the First Amendment did not require schools to affirmatively promote particular types of student speech. So that basically made it so schools across the country could have a policy of prior review and, just sort of veto student stories.
So what this bill is doing, it's allowing students to say basically whatever they want as long as it's not like legal. So as in opposition to what you just talked about.
Right. Yeah.
I'm kind of just saying that, talking about the bill a little bit. Yeah. That's what the bill is doing. So like no one at my school or institution would be able to limit what I put in the paper.
Right. Yeah. So within the text of the bill, and I actually had the opportunity to go down to Jefferson City and testify in support of this bill, which was a really cool experience. Within this bill, basically, it does basically what you talked about. It states that schools cannot restrict student journalism. It also says that schools cannot retaliate against the journalist and cannot retaliate against the student news advisor for the stories that are published within the school newspaper. And that's a really important thing because there are some advisors who have been either fired or have been transferred to a like desk job where they just make copies all day because of stories that have been written. But yeah, basically this bill does that, but it also has like some safeguards in place. So it doesn't fully take the reins off. You're still responsible for not publishing libel, you're responsible for not publishing slander, you're responsible for not advocating doing anything illegal or harmful or
Yeah,
advocating
that's what I was
harm.
getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are still some limitations, but those are limitations that apply, across the board. But yeah, this bill, HB 2918, would basically give student journalists much more protection. And, Missouri is not the only state where this is occurring. Since the Supreme Court decision, it made it a national policy. Schools are allowed to have prior review everywhere. Since then, a group called the Student Press Law Center, SPLC, not to be confused with the Southern Poverty Law Center, they've been going state to state and, helping get this New Voices legislation passed through the state legislature. So it's in a bunch of different states: California, Arkansas, West Virginia, Iowa, Illinois. But, Missouri doesn't have it yet. And they are debating that in the education committee. For just real quick plug here, for anyone who's interested in seeing this bill passed, call the members of that committee, just say you're
Sorry, which
interested
committee?
in the House Education, let me look right here, the House Committee on Elementary and Secondary Education. So call the members of that committee and tell them that you want HB 2918 passed.
Does it actually do anything?
Yeah, putting pressure on your representatives does do a lot. It signals that
Yeah,
there are
that.
people who support that, and it's something you can actively do if you're interested in and think this stuff matters.
So
But
I
yeah,
have a question for you
yeah.
quickly. We were talking about what was limited and what was not
hmm
limited. Do you think there
hmm
should be limits on what we can publish? Like generally.
I think in some instances, yeah. Obviously, if there is a story that is advocating we all find wherever Drew Garfinkel is and just sort of heckle him or do something like
Heckle.
that, obviously we shouldn't be publishing that.
Wait,
Like we
let
shouldn't
me
be,
rephrase that. If
yeah,
it's like excluding illegal things, like if it's straight up illegal, obviously that's off bounds.
yeah.
But like just what we can say, do you think that should be limited in any way?
That is a question that I think has plagued American society for like the last 150 years. Like, t- what to what
Yeah, where's the
extent does the
line?
free speech? Yeah,
Mm.
I think constitutionally, I think there should not be restriction on speech. You know, like we can disagree with speech, but this is something another person who testified said, the First Amendment protects all journalism, not just good journalism.
Mhm.
And so I think that, I think, and I believe that, and I think that, the First Amendment applies not just to things we believe in, but also things we disagree with. And there should be equal protection for those ideas. The First Amendment guarantees right to speech, not, right to freedom from repercussions. But I do not think that as long as it's not illegal and it's not, promoting harm or promoting law breaking, I don't think it should be censored. What
So
do you
yeah,
think?
that reminds me of a quote. It was like, I disapprove of what you say, but I will
hmm
defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah, I think we had some of that in like some of our history classrooms.
Yeah,
I think
I
it was like
don't
eighth
remember
grade.
who said it, but that's I agree with that. That although I don't agree with what a lot of people say, obviously we need this discourse and we need to have people with other opinions than us, and we can't just like shut it down.
Yeah. And that was one of the things one of the committee members said. He said that, I think even though he was a principal or an administrator at a school, and he talked about this time that, some students who were very prominent supporters of a certain issue, wrote a story that a lot of people disagreed with, but that he felt that it was important to have those kinds of discussions and discourse within a school, because not only is that good for building a sense of community for everybody, but it's also important to democracy. And, the freedom to talk and the freedom to express yourself and those freedoms are fundamentally important to us as Americans and fundamentally necessary to maintaining our democracy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I sort of wanted to ask you what you thought about your same question about like, do you think student voices should, uh, you know, be censored?
Yeah, I didn't know the answer to that. I was just kind of thinking it'd be a deep question.
Right.
It honestly depends
Mhm.
if I agree with it or not, you know?
Right.
But
All the
yeah,
stuff I
that's my
disagree
way
with,
of getting out of
yeah.
answering the question.
Yeah.
'Cause, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
all the
a
stuff I
difficult question.
disagree with, yeah, all the stuff I disagree with should never be said. All the stuff I do agree with, put it on a billboard, you know?
Yeah,
I think that's I'm wondering, do you think that the Supreme Court was incorrect when it determined that schools should have the ability to conduct prior review and that it should be a state issue and up to the specific states? Or do you think that the First Amendment does protect student journalism?
I guess a school should have the right to control what it produces and, like, what's tied back to it. Because
Hmm.
you know, if I write a piece and it reflects poorly on the school,
Hmm.
like, that could be negative. So, I also think it depends, but for your question about if it should be a federal issue or up to the state, I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, again, I'm going to point to the First Amendment here. I mean, it protects the right to the press, right? It does not specify whether that is student press or professional press, or it does not specify the press. So I think that it does, you know, defend the right to student journalism. And I mean, look, there have been cases where we have seen that the First Amendment does apply to students. Tinker v. Des Moines, the Supreme Court determined that students do have the right
Well,
to make statements and to protest on school grounds, and that those First Amendment rights do apply. And I think that the First Amendment protects the press, and it protects student press.
kind of forgot about that. Yeah, it's one of the things the First Amendment protects is
Yeah,
press, and for that to be in the First Amendment, like Bill of Rights, that's obviously like foundational U.S. stuff, foundational to our country. So
right.
yeah, I feel just because we're young shouldn't mean it doesn't apply to us.
Yeah, and I mean, if we use the argument that, oh, well, the First Amendment never specifically names student journalism, then I think that's a dangerous legal argument because the Constitution does not specifically mention a lot of things by name, yet the ideas still apply, right? And I think that it says freedom of the press, and I think that that applies to all press. Whether we agree with it or disagree with it, it applies across the board.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know how, the judicial system will view that, but I
Mhm.
think it's right there in the ink.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, there have not been any legitimate challenges to the law in any of the states that passed it, so I think that in of itself is an indication that, you know, they're on solid legal ground with this law.
So yeah,
One
hopefully
last
we see this get passed.
one last thing, before we go, how do you think, and I think we sort of answered this at the beginning, how do you think this is gonna matter to high schoolers?
What a softball question. We're the high schoolers. This is like,
Outside of high school journalists, because obviously this matters a lot to them, to the general, like, population of high schoolers, what do you think the impact is to them?
kind of sets a precedent that,
Mhm,
you know, kids have rights too, that we can do
mhm,
stuff. And there have been cases that actually this doesn't apply to you. You're in school. You can, teachers can look through your stuff legally. That
mhm,
was a thing. But like, if we see more student rights, I feel like that's a shift in the right direction.
right, and I think one last thing, and then we'll wrap this up, but I think one of the reasons that so many young people are disillusioned with our politics and with our government is because they feel underrepresented, like, they feel that the system is not made in a way that helps them or that understands them or that represents them. And I think that providing students with these rights, to where they can express themselves and to where they can share opinions and to where they can foster discourse, I think that will help young people feel as though they have some kind of say in our political system, even if they can't vote yet.
Yeah, 100%. I
Right.
feel like, you know, I'm also in that boat. Like, I feel like a bunch of 60 to 80-year-old people run the country and we can't do anything.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll be back next week with our next episode. And again, make sure you call, House reps, not just on the education committee, but, just any House rep you can think of that might be willing to support this. And then if it passes the House, any senator you think might be willing to support this. Send them an email, call them, do whatever you can if you think this bill is important. All right, and we'll see you guys next time.